Thank you for listening to Life Improvement Radio. You are listening to a rebroadcast of a previously recorded show.
All right, we're passing it back over to Casey as we're going on to our next guest, and we just keep rolling through the guests. Again, I'm live tweeting at the Miami Book Fair as well, using at Total Book Blog and also at Total Tutor. Who is our next guest, Casey?
Andrea Mays.
Oh, did you say it is? Andrea Mays?
Oh, I'm sorry, Andrea Mays.
All right, Andrea, thanks for calling, and how are you, Andrea?
Well, thank you. Happy to be here in Miami.
Oh, and are you enjoying the weather? I heard it's gorgeous, isn't it?
It is. It's absolutely the perfect weekend to come out and meet book people, read books, buy books. It's absolutely fantastic.
And is this your first time at the fair?
It is. This is the first time I've been to Miami.
Really? Okay. So you're enjoying the atmosphere of the book fair, but also the culture of Miami. And there's no place like Miami.
Absolutely enjoying it. After my presentation this afternoon, I plan to soak up some more of the local color.
What's your presentation going to be on, Andrea?
I'm going to be talking about my first book. It's called The Millionaire and the Bard, Henry Folger's Obsessive Hunt for Shakespeare's First Folio, on a panel with two other authors. And we're going to be talking about essentially memoir, biography. I'm going to be talking about how a single book changed the course of English language literature, and that is the book that I wrote about, which is the First Folio of Shakespeare's plays.
Wow. Very, very interesting indeed. When you talk about writing a memoir, you definitely have to get out of your comfort zone, don't you, when writing something like that?
Well, yeah,
about
I
somebody.
haven't written, this is not my memoir, but they're...
but somebody else, no, I agree, but I'm just saying, because especially when you're learning about that person and writing about their story and different things like this is all personal account things or research that you found out of that person. And that's what you're trying to do in delving into the presentation, correct?
That's right, and I did most of my research in one place, the archive that has all the letters and papers of Henry Folger at the Folger Library in Washington, D.C., and I read thousands and thousands of letters, notes, memoranda, all in his own words, and through this found out who he was as a collector, who he was as a businessman, and a little bit of who he was as a man. There's not that much that's personal in there, except his letters home from college when he was a very young man.
When you first learned about him, what strikes you so much about him?
I think I had visited the Folger Shakespeare Library when I lived in Washington, D.C. in the early 1980s, and I knew about the Folger editions of the Shakespeare plays, the books that are published by the library, and I knew a little bit about Folger as a defendant in the Standard Oil antitrust case from 1911. But I really didn't know that much about what he had done with his wealth. I didn't know that the Folger Library was connected to this guy who was at Standard Oil. And nowhere at the library is there really an indication of where the money came from. So the library is really an Elizabethan, Jacobean world, and there's really no Standard Oil there. And I thought, well, people should know where this came from, that 9 to 5, this guy ran the largest and most reviled corporation in the world. And after 5 o'clock, he went home and he looked through catalogs with his wife, and he ordered books and he unpacked books and he read books, and he was, essentially like the chairman of ExxonMobil today. And then after hours, he did this absolutely magnificent magnificent collection of Shakespeareana. So I thought he was. How did he do this? What kind of a man was he? Was he sort of a hard bargain driving kind of guy, or what exactly was he? And that's really what I hope to unearth.
Well, I think, again, when you look at these tycoons, these millionaires, that they did certain things that were not the greatest and then decided to be philanthropists at the end. of their lives or at different times in their life. You look at the Vanderbilts, you look at the Carnegies, you look at all these different people, and they specifically in their wealth and ideas and finally giving back to culture. What did you gain from learning about Folger's life and what kind of person he was?
Well, first let me distinguish Carnegie and Folger from a lot of the rest of the Gilded Age collectors in that both Carnegie and Folger gave away tremendous amounts of their wealth while they were still living. So Carnegie just, he built all these libraries and so on, and he really enjoyed Rockefeller as well. John D. Rockefeller was not a collector, but he enjoyed giving away his wealth while he was still alive. I grew up in New York City, and I was surrounded by the Gilded Age. And even as a teenager, I was aware across the street from my church was the Carnegie Mansion, which if you paid a fee, you could get a key and you could get into the garden and you could play in the garden. We did that as kids. My bus stop across the street from the Frick Mansion, so I knew who Henry Clay Frick was and what he had done. Our middle school science trip was to the Pound Ridge Reservation in Westchester County, New York. That was donated by the Rockefellers, close to where their home in Pecanico Hills is. And so I grew up around the benefits of these men's generosity. I didn't always know where the money came from. That was a little bit later in college after I started studying economics that I really started delving into where did all this come from. And if you go into the New York Public Library on 42nd Street and you look at the ceiling, you see the names of all these men whose book collections became the germ of the New York Public Library. Who are they and where did they make their money? That was really the beginning of that.
Yeah, and that's what you think about how they made their money, but then giving it back while they're alive, like you said about Carnegie, and the benefit. They hurt lots of people in certain ways because of just how they had a lot of greed in their lives, but yet then finally had this turn. They made this turn in life. And I don't really tell the story as being one of greed because especially at the early part of the history of Standard Oil, at the early part of the history of the company, it did things that were tremendously beneficial both to society and to consumers. And as a consequence of that, one of the reasons they were so reviled was their competitors despised them. And they, if you imagine you have got a way of cutting costs, and you can, let's say, cut your transportation costs, which are about 40% of your total cost, and you can drive all of your competitors out of business, well, they're not going to be happy with you. And one competitor or one supplier in particular, a barrel maker from Western Pennsylvania, was driven out of business in part because John D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company hired their own coopers, bought their own forest of oak so that they could make their own barrels and cut the barrel makers out of the loop and lower their costs. Well, one barrel maker's daughter wrote a series of articles for McClure's magazine, and then those articles were collected into a book in the early 1900s. And this woman is Ida Tarbell, and she really created the world's impression of what the Standard Oil Company was, but she was hardly a disinterested party. And her middle-class upbringing had basically been wiped out by the fact that her father lost his job. So at the very beginning, the things that Standard Oil did were very pro-consumer, very competitive, and their competitors were unhappy. Now, later on, and this is really beyond the scope of what I wrote about in the book, later on they did things that they should not be proud of that were anti-consumer, including essentially conspiring with the railroads and getting other competitors out of the market. But that's really much later history. But definitely part of the book is definitely his hunt for Shakespeare's First Folio. And what made Henry so much want that First Folio?
Well, he was not just a collector. He didn't look at these as fetish objects as some collectors did. he did study Shakespeare. He started studying Shakespeare when he was a young man at Amherst, and continued for the rest of his life. And I think, in part, he was aware how important the book was to the survival of Shakespeare's plays. So even people who teach Shakespeare or love the plays or go see the plays all the time are not aware that half of Shakespeare's plays had not been published by the time Shakespeare died. And as a result of that, had this book not been published, this First Folio not been published by two of Shakespeare's actor friends and fellow shareholders at the Globe Theater, half of his plays would have disappeared onto the ash heap of history. Cymbeline, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, and Macbeth. So can you imagine no Macbeth in high school?
Yes.
This book single-handedly, arguably, saved those plays from the ash heap of history. So Folger knew how important the book was. He knew that these two great unsung heroes of English language literature, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, these two actors, how they had edited the manuscripts or whatever sources they had available to them and said, okay, well, we acted in these plays, so we know how it was performed, not this way, but that way. And really gave us the versions of the plays that we sort of know and love.
Wow. Very, very interesting. Where is the best place we can find information? I like talking about certain really tycoons were able to give back and how they searched for the love of art and the conversation and to know about how they benefited other people's lives by giving away their money in certain ways, and the discussion of your book. Where's the best place we can purchase it, Andrea?
Oh, it's available on Amazon, and I have an author page there that will tell people where it is that I'm going to be appearing over the next year or so, talking about the book. And, Amazon is probably the best. It's also in your local bookseller if you're in Miami, Books and Books, and your local independent bookseller as well, and I'll be around at a bunch of those coming up soon. I'll be in Binghamton, New York in a couple weeks and signing at River Reads and on and on. It's available everywhere.
Oh, well, keep up the good work, and I'm sure enjoy this trip to Miami. It's going to be a whirlwind, and good luck in your presentation today, so take care.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, now back to Casey.
Thank you for listening to Life Improvement Radio. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own and shall not be construed in any way as advice from Life Improvement Radio. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our website. Personal perspectives expressed by the producers, writers, or editors will always be presented as such. Any rebroadcast or retransmission without the expressed written consent of Life Improvement Radio is strictly prohibited. Thanks for listening.